The chapel is dedicated to Santa Maria de los Buenos Aires. Saint Mary of the Good Winds was the patron saint of navigators and a favorite of Columbus. This altar painting dates from shortly after Columbus died and features what's considered the first and most accurate portrait of the great explorer on the left. It's also thought to be the first painting of Indians done in Europe. The Virgin's cape seems to protect everyone under it, even the Indians.
I don't think people necessarily understand what happened last week with the Make America Great Again hat. What are you trying to do with the message you're sending?
Well, it was really just my subconscious. It was a feeling I had, you know, like people were taught how to think, we're taught how to feel. We don't know how to think for ourselves. We don't know how to feel for ourselves. People say feel free, but they don't really want us to feel free. And I felt a freedom in, first of all, just doing something that everybody tells you not to do. I just love Trump. That's my boy. Like, you know, it's like so many rappers, you'll look at a video of Snoop Dogg loving Trump, but then he get in the office and now they don't love him. Like, Trump is one of rap's favorite people, right?
But we talk about this, that before he was elected president, people in hip hop, it was an in thing to put Donald Trump in your rhyme somewhere.
And by the way, I am in hip hop, but I'm not just in hip hop. I'm a black person in the black community, but I'm not just that. I feel like one thing is people try to minimize me to artists, hip hop, black community. Yeah, I'm always gonna represent that, but I also represent the world. When you hear about slavery for 400 years, that sounds like a choice.
What did you say, nigga?
You hear about slavery for 400 years, that sounds like a choice. You hear about slavery for 400 years, that sounds like a choice. Like, you was there for 400 years and it's all of y'all?
After the Civil War, black Southerners were no longer slaves, but they were not yet free.
The sheriff could sell free black people to corporations and coal mines.
For 80 years, thousands of blacks were forced to labor against their will.
He said, if I don't go to work, he'll put me in the river down there.
One of America's most shameful chapters, slavery by another name.
Mr. President, I have a brother about 14 years old. A man hired him from me and I heard of him no more. He went and sold him to McGree and they's been working him in prison for 12 months. I asked him to let me have him, but he won't let him go.
For a period of nearly 80 years, between the Civil War and World War II, black Southerners were no longer slaves, but they were not yet free. In one of the most shameful and little-known chapters of American history, generations of black Southerners were forced to labor against their will.
From almost the first moment, white Southerners were responding to try to put African Americans back into a position as close to slavery as they possibly could.
The Old South and what was quickly becoming the New South could not proceed without the work of African Americans.
But if you had something for free in the past, you don't necessarily want to pay for it now.
It was a straight, simple, exploitative system. There was only power, there was only force, and there was only brutality.
What happened in that period of time was so much more terrible than anything most Americans recognize or understand today. The depth of poverty, the inability of African Americans to access any of the mechanisms of wealth achievement and growth, are all rooted in this terroristic kind of regime that existed in so many places.
Their ability to have what we call the American dream. That is what has been stolen from black folks all through the South. And that legacy has to be understood so that people will be able to speak to it and give our ancestors voice.
My name is Sharon Malone, and my family is originally from Wilcox County, Alabama. My father was born in 1893. As a child, I never knew why Dad didn't share many of the stories growing up in the rural South. There was so little that I actually knew about, the generations beyond my parents. And I realized, I said, why don't I know these stories, and why don't I know who those people are? African Americans are innately wired to want to know who we are. It's almost like being an adopted child. We have no understanding of not only what we have endured, but what we have survived.
Freedom, oh, freedom.
Freedom must have felt glorious to those who'd never known it. With the end of the Civil War and the passage of the 13th Amendment, 4 million former slaves could embark on new lives with no one in charge but themselves.
And go home to my Lord and be free.
And what they desired more than anything was independence. They wanted independence from white owners. They wanted their own churches. They wanted their own schools. They wanted freedom to move.
African Americans after emancipation are looking at the potential, not only to enjoy and receive freedom, but to live it. They're deeply committed to reaffirming marriage vows. They're deeply committed to reconstituting families.
Ezekiel Archie, born into slavery, was 6 when freedom came. His mother moved the family, Zeke, his 2 brothers and a sister, from Georgia to Alabama, away from the old plantation and toward a new future.
African Americans were willing to work very hard and exploit themselves in the same way that immigrants who have come to this country have exploited themselves and their families with long work days. They were willing to do that, but they wanted to own their own land. They wanted to control those hours. They wanted to be the ones to decide.
John Davis was born a dozen years after the war. He grew up in freedom, working hard on an Alabama farm rented by his parents.
There was a tremendous motivation and desire to integrate into American life.
Green Cottonham, born in 1885, was also the son of an Alabama farmer. He came of age in a nation that was increasingly urban, industrial, and modern.
This is a photo of George Cottingham. He's my great-grandfather. He was actually Green Cottingham's first cousin. How hopeful my Cottingham ancestors must have been about bright futures for their family. These were hard-working, honest people.
But freedom had come at a tremendous cost. The war devastated the Southern economy, which had supported one of the wealthiest aristocracies in the world.
The cotton economy was in complete shambles. The fields had been burned, the cotton gins had been destroyed, equipment that was necessary for the production of cotton didn't exist anymore. But also the primary engine of the economy, of the cotton economy, that being the labor of slaves, was lost.
In the 5 major cotton states of the Deep South, nearly half of all capital, nearly half of all investment was in human beings. So when those human beings were confiscated, when the investment was transferred, in essence, from slaveholders to the people themselves, that meant a huge loss of capital to Southern slaveholders, to the people who controlled the economy of the South.
A tiny slave-holding elite had owned the majority of the region's 4 million slaves. Among them was Lucinda Comer, a widow. After the war, she and her sons oversaw the family's enterprises in cotton, lumber, and corn.
I'm the great-great-granddaughter of B.B. Comer, who was the governor of Alabama, and the great-great-niece of J.W. Comer. The things that I heard about the Comer men, especially B.B. Comer, were about their entrepreneurial spirit and being self-made men. There was never a fool or a coward, it was said, in the Comer family.
Emancipation turned the former slaveholding world upside down.
The simple reality of people that they had once owned now were entitled to the same fruits of their labor, the same ability to look a white person in the eye, a man or a woman, and to demand equal respect, to be called by one's first and last names, challenged everything to the bitter core of white people's souls.
You have a group of people who are accustomed to have people serve them. Now, suddenly, these people are free. They own guns. You'd be as worried as hell. Because what you're worried is that people are going to take revenge. You also are worried that people aren't going to do any work anymore.
Most of the South's 8 million whites had not owned slaves. Poverty was widespread, and about a third of whites were illiterate.
Those individuals see blacks moving around, trying to get land, trying to improve themselves as competitors. They see a zero-sum game in which they're going to lose the more that blacks gain.
These whites aligned with leaders of the former Confederacy, aided by President Andrew Johnson, Lincoln's successor. They formed vigilante groups to attack and intimidate blacks. The violence grew widespread. In the spring of 1866, Congress intervened. Over the objections of the president, it launched an era known as Radical Reconstruction.
At the beginning of Reconstruction, there was a tremendous federal will to both bring the South into submission, but also to protect African American civil rights.
Passed in 1866, the 14th Amendment recognized the citizenship of all freed people. In 1870, the 15th Amendment was passed, which upheld the right of black men to vote.
Reconstruction was an attempt to create a country in which it would be possible to have a biracial and equal citizenship.
Reconstruction gave African Americans, for the first time across the South, the opportunity to serve on juries, to be witnesses in trial, to serve as judges. It also made possible an entire generation of black politicians across the South, almost as many as 1,500 serving through the end of the 19th century.
Reconstruction governments in many parts of the South succeeded in passing new social legislation, creating the South's first free public schools. But white resistance to biracial government in the South intensified, and national political support began to wane. By 1874, voters had shifted the balance of power in Congress, allowing for the South's return to local control.
There is no sustained federal presence in the South really after 1874. What they come away with is that a sense that this is a really violent situation and that there's not much we can do about it. And there's not much perhaps we even should do about it.
African Americans seeking freedom could count on less and less help from the federal government, less and less help from sympathetic Northerners, and they could count on more and more and more animosity and attack from Southern whites.
I grew up in a black part of Mississippi, and I went to schools that were 60, 75% black all through my childhood. That was in the 1970s. What I learned about the Emancipation Proclamation was the most simplistic version of it, that it brought an end to slavery. I also was taught, as most Americans were in some way, that the end of slavery unleashed this population of people who were ill-equipped for freedom. And that was all offered up in some respect as an explanation for the repressive things that were then done to African Americans, even the repressive things that I knew about. What I came to realize was that that fundamentally didn't happen.
With the end of Reconstruction, the nature of both crime and punishment in the South changed dramatically. In state after state and county after county, new laws targeted African Americans and effectively criminalized black life. New laws targeted African Americans and effectively criminalized black life.
You hear about slavery for 400 years. For 400 years, that sounds like a choice.
It was a crime in the South for a farm worker to walk beside a railroad. It was a crime in the South to speak loudly in the company of white women. It was a crime to sell the products of your farm after dark.
Anything from spitting or drinking or being found to be drunk in public or loitering in public spaces could result in confinement. So there was an over-exaggeration of African-American criminality during this time period. It's not to absolve all prisoners from having committed crimes, but there were many trumped-up charges.
One of the most infamous set of laws to come out of this period were the pig laws, passed in Mississippi, Georgia, Florida, Alabama, enhancing penalties for what had been previously misdemeanor offenses to now felony offenses.
In Mississippi, theft of a pig worth as little as $1 could mean 5 years in prison. In Tennessee, hard labor might result from stealing an 8-cent fence rail.
But the most powerful, the most damaging of all of these laws were the vagrancy statutes. In every southern state, you became a criminal if you could not prove at any given moment that you were employed.
Under slavery, most black crime was punished by slaveholders, leaving the courts to discipline whites. Now, only about 10% of those arrested were white.
Now, what does this mean? Does this mean that white people are not committing crimes in the South? We know that's not true.
Southern states had a history of placing prisoners with industries that would bear the cost of guarding and housing them in exchange for their labor. Now states also began to charge fees, renting prisoners to companies by the month. The highest rates were for the strongest workers and longest sentences.
When you go to the 13th Amendment, one of the fascinating things about the text of that amendment is that it says that slavery is abolished, except in the case of a punishment for a crime. And within that wiggle room, what you see in it is that there's still the possibility of extending slavery, as it were, by another name.
Well, it's early in the morning, baby, when I rise,
The system was known as convict leasing.
when I rise, it's early in the morning.
It took time for the system of convict leasing to develop. It took time for the state to realize that prisoners, believe it or not, could be a source of profit. Once that revenue starts coming in, they're pleasantly surprised. This is new revenue we never had before.
The state of Alabama earned $14,000 in its first year of convict leasing, 1874. By 1890, revenue was $164,000, roughly $4.1 million today. By then, states throughout the South and hundreds of counties and cities were engaged in some form of leasing convicts to private industry.
And it gave tremendous discretionary power for the private owner, either a landowner or a corporation or a coal mine, could be any business concern, to do what they wanted with that African American.
I'm not white or red or black, I'm brown.
We as convicts is something like a man drowning. We have been convicted of felonies, and because of that, we have lost every friend on earth.
In 1884, a series of remarkable letters was sent from the Pratt coal mines to Alabama's new inspector of prisons. Their author was Ezekiel Archie, now a 25-year-old convict.
All these years of how we suffered, we have looked death in the face, worked hungry, thirsty, half-clothed, and sore.
Archie was one of hundreds of convicts now being worked in a growing network of mines and factories around Alabama's new industrial center, Birmingham. Founded in 1871 and fed by intersecting railway lines, Birmingham was poised to exploit Alabama's rich underground deposits of coal, limestone, and iron ore, the ingredients of steel. This was the new industrial South, envisioned just prior to the Civil War by slaveholder John T. Milner.
John T. Milner was a brilliant engineer, extraordinary businessman. He was also a supreme racist and a despotic person.
Negro labor can be made exceedingly profitable in manufacturing iron and in rolling mills, provided there is an overseer, a Southern man who knows how to manage Negroes.
He laid out some of the first railroad lines that would run across Alabama. In many respects, he was the father of Southern industrialization, particularly in the deep, deep South.
Milner's vision triggered decades of rapid industrial growth. After emancipation, industrialists replaced slaves with convicts, acquiring thousands from state and county governments.
You can't drive free labor the same way that you can force prisoners to mine 5 tons of coal a day. And this is why people like Milner wanted prisoners in his coal mines. He saw them as a great source of profit, and he didn't have to worry about labor disputes.
We would leave the cells around 3 o'clock a.m. and return at 8 o'clock p.m., going the distance of 3 miles through rain or snow.
To describe the conditions in a coal mine at this time, is to say that they're primitive is, you can't even imagine it.
This is a place where, for weeks or months at a time, men might never see daylight. The mine was often filled with standing water around their ankles and their feet. They had to drink from that water. Disease ran rampant through these mines.
They were incredibly dangerous places to work, being subjected to violent explosions, poisonous gases that were released as coal fell from the walls. In addition to the falling coal itself,
Whippings, keeping people chained up, brutal kinds of physical torture, and mental abuse are the norm. A lot of the things that kept people in control under slavery are amplified under this convict system.
Zeke Archie was one of about 500 convicts at the Pratt mines near Birmingham, nearly half the company's workforce. They were overseen by J.W. Comer, the former slaveholder, whose enterprises now included convict mining.
That Comer's a hard man. I've seen him. I've seen him hit men 100 and 160 times with a 10-prong strap. Then say they was not whipped.
When I learned about the brutality of J.W. Comer, I just started weeping. And I actually didn't leave my house for 2 days because I was in such a state of grief and shock. The stories that I heard about all the Comer men when I was growing up were about self-made men. And so to learn about the ways that they weren't really self-made, but were making themselves on the backs and by the blood of other people, specifically the blacks in the convict leasing system, definitely shattered that image for me.
He'd go off after an escaped man one day and dig his grave the same day.
Exposés of the convict labor system described it as worse than slavery. Slaves had been a significant long-term investment. A convict could be rented for as little as $9 a month.
It was never in the economic interest of a slave owner to kill his own slaves or to abuse them so terribly that they couldn't work anymore. So their economic value protected them in certain ways. After the Civil War, someone working these kinds of forced laborers would push them to the very limits of human endurance.
We are the men who do the work. Look at the white men. How many are cutting 5 or 4 ton coal per day? They are few.
Convict leasing was a source of labor where you could realize the maximum return at a minimum social cost. The feeding, of course, was next to nothing. Health was next to nothing.
Convict miners cost as much as 50 to 80% less than free miners, and could be worked 6 days a week. Their presence allowed companies to depress wages and resist unions.
When one could obtain black labor at almost no cost, the profits for that form of business were enormous.
In Florida, prisoners extracted gum and resin from tall pines and transformed it into turpentine. In Georgia, they hauled wet clay from riverbanks, molding it into the millions of bricks needed for new buildings and homes. From Texas to Louisiana, convicts forced their way through acres of virgin forest, harvesting timber and building railroads. In all, more than 15,000 prisoners worked in Southern industry in 1886. And that number was rising quickly. In many labor camps, as many as a third of male convicts were boys younger than 16. Girls and women were also forced into labor.
Over 90% of convict laborers in Georgia were African-American men. The next highest percentage would obviously be white men, but African-American women were also utilized in these various tasks in manual labor. Black women are working in brickyards, in turpentine camps, in mining camps, farms, in lumber yards.
Convict leasing becomes a new form of economic development in the South and a ubiquitous form of punishment for Southerners as the criminal justice system expanded itself.
And sweeps would take place all throughout the South, whether it was for a dice game, whether it was for an altercation, whether it was for being mouthy or uppity.
The record of thousands upon thousands of people arrested in this way is everywhere in the South. In the fall, when it was time to pick cotton, huge numbers of black people are arrested in all of the cotton-growing counties. There are surges in arrests in counties in Alabama in the days before, coincidentally, a labor agent from the coal mines in Birmingham is coming to town that day to pick up whichever county convicts are there.
Some charges were serious, but more than 2/3 of all state prisoners at the time of Zeke Archie's arrest, including Archie, were convicted under vague charges of burglary and larceny. County prisoners, too, were sent to the mines. For often trivial offenses, they faced the real possibility of death. In some Alabama prison camps, convicts died at a rate of 30 to 40% a year.
And this system is one that I think in many ways needs to be understood as brutal in a social sense, but fiendishly rational in an economic sense. Because where else could one take a black worker and work them literally to death after slavery? And when that worker died, one simply had to go and get another convict.
The South's prison population continued to grow, reaching 19,000 people by 1890. Nearly 90% of those held were African American. When folded into national statistics, the concentration of black prisoners seemed to reflect an alarming rise in black crime.
So as early as 1890, African Americans are almost 3 times overrepresented in the prison population. The general population is 12%. The nation's prisons population of blacks is 30%.
So there are many important implications and long-term consequences for this convict leasing system. Not only is it so oppressive, but when you have an overwhelmingly black prison population, It cements that relationship between criminality and race in people's minds to the degree that it's seen as something inherent.
Southern editorialists, sociologists, politicians are all saying that the statistics prove that black people are a criminal race and that freedom had been a mistake.
If you were to ask most Southerners, white Southerners, what they thought of African Americans in the 1850s, the 1860s, even into the 1870s, one profile would have been of people who are loyal, dutiful, trustworthy. Those same people in the 1880s and by the 1890s have been demonized. They no longer are trustworthy. They no longer have the capacity for citizenship.
By the 1890s, white voters had reversed the civil rights gains made during Reconstruction. New state constitutions kept blacks out of voting booths and limited funding for black schools. Racial segregation was mandated by law.
They do this because it's important to remind black people day after day after day, minute after minute, that they have a place in this society and that that place is subordinate. So what that means is that when a black person is walking down the street and a white person walks towards them, they step into the gutter.
My name is Barbara Jean Belial. I was born in Birmingham in 1936. You had to stay in your place. Now, my daddy was the one who was daring. He used to be called that uppity nigger by white folks because he believed that we were just as good as anybody else. He's a smart man. He was one of the first black men in this area to register to vote. There were a lot of times truckloads of KKK folks would pass by the house. He had made white folks mad about something. He wouldn't let my mother work. She went to clean up a house one time, and he went over to pick her up, and she was cleaning out some of the cabinets down there on her knees, trying to clean out. He told her, "You're not going back. You cleaned up your own cabinets." I mean, that's the kind of man he was. But he's another story, though, and I have to talk about him at another time.
Segregation was not only mandated by Southern states, it was upheld by the U.S. Supreme Court in an 1896 ruling, Plessy versus Ferguson.
And after that, white Southerners, white legislatures never had any reservation about imposing the most severe, the most repressive restrictions on black life.
Ezekiel Archie was scheduled for release on February 6, 1887. At the age of 28. But he was not free. A new indictment for reasons unknown was pending.
This letter is not all I could write, but my condition will not permit. Fate seems to curse the convict. Death seems to summon us hence.
As the 19th century came to a close, and for many decades to come, the possibility of freedom was overshadowed by the constant threat of forced labor and violence. Decades after the Civil War, the nation was reunited, but the place of black Americans within it seemed more uncertain than ever.
Many whites in the South are completely indifferent about whether black people live or die. They want to see them in their place. They want to see them as an exploitable system of labor. They want to see them as an affirmation of their racial superiority. And if they don't fulfill that role, then to hell with them.
Another man done gone, another man done gone from the county.
My name is Lisa McNair. I am the younger sister of Denise McNair, one of the 4 girls killed in the 1963 church bombing of the 16th Street Baptist Church, where we are today. The last trial, the Bobby Frank Cherry trial, I went just about every day and was there for the closing arguments and there when the verdict was read. And what I remember most about it was, other than thank God he's finally listening to us and has answered this prayer, I remember at the end, we were all just crying, all the families were sitting together. And then I finally just looked up to see the attorneys, and they were too, just full of tears. They were weeping, and that just meant so much to me that they cared that much, as much about our relatives as we did. It gave me a sense of hope, a sense of yes, somebody can do the wrong thing and they can be convicted of it, and justice does work. Because, you think about it, I think it was like 40 years or 37 years. Nobody had brought him even to the police station, let alone had a trial. And it was like when I asked as a kid, and they were like, well, God will be our vindicator and we'll just lean on him. And I'm like, no, like on TV, people kill somebody, they go to jail, But it was almost like we weren't afforded that luxury. He was the prosecutor of the last 2 killers of my sister. After the case, he became closer to the family and stayed close, comes by and we talk. Further down here, there have been a number of little monuments to the girls over the years, like this one here. And then there's another monument down here. And this monument, I think, is near where the bombing took place, because there was a staircase here and the dynamite was wrapped and put up under the staircase, and at the bottom of the staircase was the restrooms. So when it exploded, the girls were standing in front of a sofa by the window, and that's how they were killed. So they put this up as like a marker to them. And I'm always glad that, they're remembered. I wish they were remembered more in history books. I think our civil rights history is lacking severely in this country and in the history books of this country. And I think that's important that we remember these times, because if we don't remember our history, we'll be destined to repeat it. I know that this one is of Denise, my sister Denise. And this one is supposed to be Addie Mae Collins, because Sarah Collins, the 5th girl in the bathroom, who they don't really talk about, her sister, the last thing she remembers seeing before the bomb hit was her sister tying the sash on my sister's dress. I'd like to sit down and find out why he did that. I'd like to sit down and talk and ask them, why was he so angry? What made him hate so much? Why did he think we were so bad that he needed to kill? I mean, what? And the guy's like 70 or 80 at this point. Like, what at that point, like, have you not learned, or have you learned about how you used to feel back in the day? People ask my dad that when Denise was killed, why didn't he leave? He was a college-educated man. He could have gone anywhere. But this is home. You have to fight for your home and fight for it to be okay.
body was shipped home, back north to Chicago, where Mamie Till Bradley insisted on an open casket funeral. So all the world can see, she said, what they did to my boy.
Oh, pilgrim of sorrow, and I'm left in this old wide world.
Jet magazine showed Till's corpse, beaten, mutilated, shot through the head. An entire generation of young black people would remember the horror of that photo.
No hope for tomorrow.
Would you send an 84-year-old white grandmother to prison? What if she was the only reason why 14-year-old Emmett Till was kidnapped, viciously beaten, and killed? Welcome to Judge of Characters, where you're innocent until proven racist. Does justice have a shelf life?
Justice is always expired for people of color.
Meet Carolyn Bryant Dunham. She's the white woman who in 1955 claimed in court that 14-year-old Emmett Till not only whistled at her, but according to reports, also grabbed her and verbally threatened her.
The results are in, and the lie detector test determined that was a lie.
Right. Carolyn admitted to lying on Emmett Till over 60 years later. The U.S. Department of Justice has reactivated the investigation of Emmett Till's horrific death, revealing some new information, but they haven't specified why they've reactivated the case. Some of Black Twitter is assuming it has something to do with that lying-ass liar, Carolyn Bryant Dunham. Carolyn's lies about 14-year-old Till's alleged aggression motivated her then-husband, Roy Bryant, and his half-brother, J.W. Malam, to take Emmett from his bed in the middle of the night, force him into their truck, beat him until he was barely alive, shoot him in the head, strap a 75-pound cotton gin fan to Emmett's neck with barbed wire that weighed him down so that when they tossed him in the Tallahatchie River, he'd sink. So basically, that lying white lady killed him too.
Who white women be lying?
Carolyn confessed that she lied about being harassed by Emmett Till in a recent book by Timothy Tyson, The Blood of Emmett Till. And in it, Bryant is quoted saying, "Nothing that boy did could ever justify what happened."
I guess a conscience takes about 60 years to develop.
Not to mention, both killers confessed in 1956, a year after killing Till. One said, "I like niggers. In their place, I know how to work them. But I just decided it was time a few people got put on notice. And when a nigger gets close to mentioning sex with a white woman, he's tired of living. I'm likely to kill him." But because of our trusty justice system, the confessed killers couldn't be tried again because of double jeopardy. This type of hatred doesn't happen overnight. There's nothing worse than violent racists knowing they have nothing to lose. Carolyn had to know that all she had to do was mention that Emmett Till looked her way, and she knew they'd do something to him. It's because of Carolyn's lie that people think she deserves prosecution.
She lied, he died.
Let's look at the tweets. Carolyn Dunham is an accomplice to a confessed murder and should be in prison. That's been clear for decades now, but she's lived her life as a free woman in the world, while Emmett Till hasn't lived at all. At this rate, the Department of Justice will reopen the cases of Trayvon Martin, Tamir Rice, and Mike Brown in the year 2070. I don't understand the point of reopening the Emmett Till case. I feel like they always do investigations on these 80-year-old cases, knowing who did it already, which they did back then. They convict people that are already dead so they can't serve time. It's all a big troll. White people's feigned terror can be damning for black folks. From Carolyn's lies to the permit patties of the world who call the cops on black people living, white women like Carolyn need to be aware that their allegations have the power to steal black lives. And they rarely face any consequences for these life-threatening lies. Emmett Till's death hurt on so many levels. Not only did the men who did it get away with murder, but it was based on a false claim. Let's judge these characters. The entire justice system is guilty of only working in favor of white people. Carolyn Bryant Dunham is guilty of lying on a child, resulting in his brutal death. Just like we will always painfully remember the image of Emmett Till in his casket, I, Judge Danielle, want Carolyn Bryant Dunham and her family of lying-ass liars to have that image burned into their memories, their eyeballs. I want you to see it in your sleep. I want you to see it when you're looking in the mirror. I want you to wake up and see it. I hereby sentence Carolyn Bryant Dunham's tombstone to read, "Guilty, I killed Emmett Till." And Carolyn, now that you've lived with this guilt, you can die with it too.
A black man was babysitting a group of children, or 2 children in Marietta, Georgia, and he took them to a Walmart and a Subway. And there was a white woman who saw him and thought to her, no, that doesn't compute. There's no way a black man can be babysitting white children. She approached him and had a conversation with him and the children. Here is his Facebook video. His name's Corey Lewis. This he posted on Facebook.
Yo. I'm babysitting, right? Y'all see, look, I got 2 kids in the backseat with me. I'm babysitting. There's this lady across the street. We just came from Subway and Walmart. This lady over here, she's following me. This lady is following me because I got 2 kids in the back seat that does not look like me. This lady across the street, she asked to see the little girl that I'm with so she can ask her if she knows who I am. Y'all see this lady is not moving.
So she apparently said that she was gonna call the police, and you know what? She did, because later on he drove away and the police showed up. He also posted a video of that. Take a look at that.
You mind if I talk to him?
That's crazy.
I know, but you mind if I do?
I mean, why?
If I don't try to listen.
To fulfill her?
No, it's just something like we. Technically, at this point in time, it's like a code for it, which is like an okay check, just to make sure everything's all right. Hey, can y'all step out?
Oh, they gotta step out?
Yeah, I just want to talk to him.
Please explain to the officer who Mr. Lewis is, please.
Radio 1314, Mr.
Yeah. And he's babysitting us.
Okay.
And he took us to Petra and then took us to Subway for dinner. And then this lady started following.
So multiple times he had the police officer kept asking, "Are you okay? Are you okay?" It seemed to me like the police officer thought this was equally as ridiculous as Corey himself did. By the way, Corey runs he's not just a babysitter, he has a after-school mentorship program for kids called Sponsored by Lewis, and it seems like everybody's having like literally the best time of their lives.
Yeah, but you know what? That looks dangerous. So we got to track him. So let's break this down a little bit more. So the lady followed him for nearly an hour and all the way to his house. Now let's reverse the roles for a second. A young African-American male starts stalking a white woman around for an hour. How do you think that one ends? Okay. So, but okay, so they're a different race, so she's gonna follow them and call the cops. Now, fair is fair, and the most important thing is how do the people in power handle it, right? And the cops were great here, no problem. Look, when you get a call, you gotta go investigate it, even if you think it's, look, there's a certain threshold, I guess if it's total nonsense, hey, an alien attacked me, you probably don't have to go see Alex Jones on about that one, okay? But for most people, they get
ever really go see Alex Jones. You don't really need to ever.
Yeah, and so and the cops very kind of irrespectful and almost apologetic to Corey in this case.
Yeah,
and then actually the mom of the kids calls back later to the police department and is really angry, right? Rightfully so. She's like, look, why? Like, give me a reason. And then she says, are you saying that because there's an African-American male driving my 2 white kids that he was stopped and pulled over and questioned? And the cop says, I'm sorry, ma'am, that's exactly what I'm saying. Okay, so he's not hiding it and he's not excusing it. He's just saying, we got a call, we got to look into it. So they didn't do anything wrong. It was the person who called it in. That was the issue.
And as Corey himself points out, like the children's mother is a lawyer. So
oops.
It's rough. There's a lot of white people out there, and those are the only ones I can really like. So there's multiple white people, and there's different ways to reach out to white people. So I have to do it those different kinds of white people. I'll put on my Banana Republic for the Banana Republic white people, and just give you a little message, guys. Black people can be in your neighborhood. It doesn't mean they're robbing you. Okay. You get a Banana Republic, and then, you know, they can sell, like, brown kids can sell water outside your office, and it's okay. Okay, so that's for those people. And then also, for the other white people, I have my camouflage on. Guys, black people can have barbecues in the park. You know, I have a barracuda also. It's like a thing, it's a barracuda. Guys, this has I can put 6 beers in this camouflage sleeve. Let black people have barbecues and babysit children outside of Walmart. It's gonna be fine. From one white to another. So that's that.
Dear Allison and all white women, I'm writing you because I am you, and I'm worried about us. I'm confounded that 53% of us voted for a pussy grabber endorsed by the Ku Klux Klan. 45 was the preferred candidate of white women in every age group except millennials.
You can hide all you want. The whole world gonna see you, boo.
I'm profoundly disturbed, but not surprised, by the spate of white college-educated women calling the police on people of color for absurd reasons. My name is Karen Fleshman, and I'm the founder of Racy Conversations. Our mission is to inspire the first anti-racist generation in America.
Illegally selling water without a permit?
You got your ID on you?
Yeah, I do.
All right, can you see that?
Why?
Yeah.
Trying to break into my own apartment.
Possibly a weapon, large tool.
Oh my God.
You want to call the police on him for having a barbecue on a Sunday at the lake.
Yes.
Why are we so miserable and angry, white women? And why are we taking our anger and frustration out on people of color who've done nothing to harm us? Black women have been trying to tell us for centuries we can't end sexism without ending racism. It won't work. White women, everybody hates us. And with the exception of white men, we've earned their hatred through our lack of self-awareness and empathy. Inflicting misery on others does not make the inflictor feel good. It makes her feel miserable. What does make us feel better? Genuine connection and community. The joy of walking up to an 8-year-old girl and saying, I'm so glad you opened your business because it's a really hot day and I would love a cold water. Please, white women, let Permit Patty be the last white woman who calls the cops on a person of color. Pay attention. Change. Sincerely, Karen Fleshman.
Why would that be so?
The reason that they're being treated differently is because black people are treated poorly in this country, and they're treated differently, and they're a special class, and not in a good sense. You know, they're just like everybody else, but our country doesn't want to treat you like everybody else because we're a racist society.
Do you know the definition of civiliter mortuus?
I do not. Is that a foreign term?
No, that's Latin. That's legalese. It means dead in the eyes of the law, and that's what they attribute to people who identify themselves as colored, Negro, black, all of these colorable terms that mean nothing.
Well, I know that. I'm a criminal defense attorney in my day job, and I see that every day. And the system sucks, it's corrupt, and it's basically a way to oppress you. It's a way to imprison you. It's a way to make you convicted felon so you can't vote, you can't work, and basically keep you down. Once they got rid of the Jim Crow laws, what they did is they jacked up the criminal justice system. In a way, it would have been better if you hadn't won your civil rights, because this is even worse.
And being arrested could make you a legal slave. Is that correct? Under the third.
Yeah.
White people did not exist before 1681. Again, white people did not exist on planet Earth until 1681. Number two, any claim that this group called white people, any claim that that group is rooted in biology or derived from genes or biology or is innate or is from nature is a lie. Third and final point, as a matter of foundational law, actually let me say it this way, white supremacy has been embedded in the United States of America from its founding as a matter of law. Now, I don't expect you to buy all that, to get all that, to believe all that, at least not now. But my job is to share with you the legal history that proves each of those three claims that I begin with. So let's go. Let's get started. We have to begin this conversation in colonial North America, specifically in the colonies, the British colonies of Maryland and Virginia. Both were British colonies, and both shared a number of particular characteristics. First, their economies were rooted in tobacco farming. If you know much about tobacco farming, it requires tremendous human labor, lots and lots of workers. So those who owned large plantations, big landholders, constantly needed laborers to do the work to grow the tobacco. In addition to sharing an economic base, both colonies had an incredible gender imbalance, roughly 10 men for every woman. Now, let's understand a little bit about the folks who constitute the people in these two colonies. Oh, and by the way, let me give you a year. We're in the early 1600s, okay? The early part of the 17th century, colonial North America. England had, for some bizarre reason that today demographers cannot explain, there was a population boom in England in the early 17th century. So there were lots and lots of poor British people who were on the public doles, who couldn't find a way to make a living, who couldn't feed themselves. So the king in England was quite happy to have them sign a contract of indenture to then go work in the British colonies. And that is what happened. Both indentured and enslaved persons, according to historian Edmund Morgan, were sold and traded like cattle. But of course, not all laborers stand equal in terms of their labor agreement or lack thereof. Those who came under a term of indenture worked for a term of years, and presumably this indenture was an agreement that they chose to enter into. The terms of indenture were largely protected by British law. although the terms that took form in colonial North America were quite different than those that existed in England. For example, in England, indentured servants could marry because that was viewed as the way to produce the next group of workers. In this country, indentured servants were prohibited from marrying, and if women were unfortunate enough to get pregnant during their term of indenture, they added usually about 7 to 9 years onto their term of indenture and 1 year to the father. Slavery, of course, was a status that came with life, work for life. There was neither British law nor international law to prohibit or restrict slavery. What we do know is that at this time period in colonial North America, there were free persons of African descent. We know that landholders freed slaves. They did so in wills. They did so by allowing them to purchase their own freedom or the freedom of a family member. The vast majority of workers, laborers, in colonial North America at this time were British men, British workers, the vast majority. There were some women, there were some European laborers from Portuguese, Dutch, folks from Ireland and from Scotland are also revealed in the records, but the vast majority were British men. There were small numbers of persons of African descent, and there were even smaller numbers of members of native tribes. There were small numbers of persons of African descent, and there were even smaller numbers of members of native tribes. But in this slide, I'm trying to capture the socioeconomic ladder, and really that ladder should be about as long as this room. The landholding elite are, in today's parlance, that's the 1%. And the vast majority of folks who were in the colonies were laborers. Again, they were British, other Europeans, Africans, and members of native tribes. Here's what I find folks have the most difficult time with. We tend to really struggle with getting a good picture of social life, the social context at this juncture. We're very good at understanding the social relations that exist later, and we'll talk about those in a moment. But pre-Bacon's Rebellion society is something that we generally in this country struggle to grasp. So I'm going to do my best to paint a broad stroke picture of this time period. What we know is that British and African laborers worked, ate, and slept together. Furthermore, the evidence from this period, which covers the first 3/4 of the 17th century, that the anecdotal evidence reveals that they lived under similar conditions and faced the same opportunities and chances to make it once one was free of their term of service, whether free of enslavement or free of indenture. So let's review this. British laborers constituted the vast majority of the populations in both colonial Maryland and colonial Virginia. All men, of course, because the law of coverture, let me tell you something about that law of coverture. The law of coverture is derived from British common law, and it structures marriage. And this is how Barrister Blackstone famously described the law of coverture. In marriage, the man and the woman become one, and the one is the man. You didn't have the right to retain your own wages. You couldn't create estate planning, wills, or trusts without the approval of a man. So all men who were free of indenture or enslavement faced the same opportunities in these colonies as a matter of law. For example, free men of African descent could own servants or slaves, and they did. They could vote, and they did. They could marry persons of the opposite sex. God, and I love that I have to make that qualification now. Woo! They could marry persons of the opposite sex regardless of national origin, and they did. In fact, marriages between men of African descent and women primarily of British descent were not uncommon at all. In one county, 1/2 of the free men of African descent were married to a European woman. There was a challenge to these marriages, but it did not come from the masses. It came from elites, and that's what we're going to talk about next. All right, this little depiction is meant to be a depiction of the lawmakers in Maryland, colonial Maryland lawmakers. They passed a law in 1664 punishing, and I quote, British and other freeborn women who marry enslaved Negro men. The punishment for entering into these marriages was that the woman herself would be enslaved for her husband's life, and any children they have would be enslaved into their 20s. Now imagine that you are a plantation owner. That's not a bad deal. I get more property. I like that. And that is exactly what happened. Rather than deter these marriages, which is the express intent of the law of 1664, rather than deter them, these marriages were encouraged by property owners because that, in fact, that such a marriage increased their property value. This law of 1664 represents, if not the first, certainly the precursor to anti-miscegenation law. These are laws that punished or prohibited marriage between, notice that white people didn't exist yet in 1664, at least as referenced in that law. But most generally speaking, anti-miscegenation law prohibited and punished marriages between a white person and a specific non-white person or persons. Let me be really clear. I read all the time in history books, in academic texts, and I read anti-miscegenation law described as prohibiting interracial marriage. That's not correct. For example, a member of a native tribe could marry a person of Chinese descent. Both were understood as racially distinct, but never did anti-miscegenation law prohibit such kinds of marriages. The only marriages that anti-miscegenation law prohibited were those between a white person and always a person of African descent, and sometimes various other groups. Okay, so just so we're really clear about anti-miscegenation law and its link to whiteness. A couple other things to note about anti-miscegenation law. It's not derived from British law. Anytime we look at law and study history and you see a break from British common law, you always want to pay attention because it tells us something about the needs and desires of those who wielded power in the colonial context. So anti-miscegenation law was one of these laws. They were passed colony by colony and then state by state. It's a really important area of law for a number of reasons. But for our purpose this morning is because it's where this human category called white first appears on planet Earth, the first time. In addition, anti-miscegenation law is important because it lasted more than 300 years. These anti-miscegenation laws literally shaped the faces of this group of more than 2,000 X number of people that I'm looking at today. The Maryland legislature sought to correct for the encouragement of marriages that they described in that previous law of 1664 as, quote, a disgrace, unquote, to the British people, as an indication that the, quote, British or freeborn woman must be forgetful of her status as free, end quote. So they passed the law of 1681. And in this law, it made it illegal for British and other white women from marrying a Negro slave. And furthermore, the law punished any landholder who encouraged the marriages and any religious authority who performed it. This law equals the invention of the human category white. Did these group of laborers, some of whom were from Portugal, some from Holland, some from Ireland, Scotland, did they have a little genetic transformation that occurred right after the General Assembly in Maryland met, creating a genetic sludge that we can now call white? Virginia passed its first anti-miscegenation law in 1691. In Virginia, the law prohibited both white men and white women from marrying a person of African descent or a member of a native tribe. But lest I leave you thinking that gender equality was being created in this law, let me quickly dispel that. Studies of antebellum courts reveal that, in fact, anti-miscegenation law was that, at least in the language of the law, prohibited these marriages for white men and white women. But here's what we know from antebellum court cases. We know that plenty of white men married and or engaged in intimate sexual relations with prohibited women. However, very rarely were they brought to court and punished under the anti-miscegenation law. Very rarely. So here, pay attention to this. This law, in its enforcement, is largely focused on controlling the relationality and the sexuality of white women and non-white men. Furthermore, think about the enforcement practices that come out of this particular law. What's the result? Who becomes more available for who? We see a further step in locating patriarchal power squarely among and within white men. We've talked about the law of 1664 and the amendment to that law in 1681. And we've noted that the key difference between those two is the reference to the group who's of concern. The language has shifted from British and other freeborn to British and other white women in that particular law. So the question becomes, well, what the heck happened between 1664 and 1681? And the answer is Bacon's Rebellion. This was a massive revolt in the colony of Virginia that lasted more than a year. Let me give some background of the seeds of this rebellion, what helped give rise to this violent outburst. Those who were enslaved, I don't think it's hard to imagine, were by definition of their status disgruntled laborers. And remember that pool of readily available workers from England who were poor and happily sent off in the guts of ships? Well, they dried up. That population surge ended, and there was no longer a pool of laborers from Britain available to handle the work on the plantations in the colonies. The result is they began to impose harsher punishments on indentured servants who were already here, so that relatively minor infractions would result in significant extensions to their years of service. Those who completed their term of indenture or who were released from their status as enslaved were frustrated. They were frustrated because the King of England gave almost all of the farmable land to his buddies. And even if they could find land to grow tobacco on, prices dropped and taxes went up. So land and other opportunities became much more limited. So this guy, Nathaniel Bacon, the guy pointing his arm, he didn't have to search very far for disgruntled laborers. Both those who were enslaved or indentured faced worse treatment, and those freed faced less ability to make a future for themselves. Persons of European and African descent fought in the first phase of Bacon's rebellion against members of native tribes, and then in the second phase of Bacon's rebellion against the British ruling elite. Nathaniel Bacon ultimately died from wounds that he received in a battle, and England sent troops into the colony, and that eventually quashed the rebellion. But not without having made a significant impression upon those who wielded authority and were threatened by this rebellion. Remember, this rebellion lasted over a year, and records from lawmakers in Virginia to the Legal Oversight Authority in England revealed that over 30% of the population were in support of the rebellion. Here were the lessons from Bacon's rebellion. A united labor force is a threat to the form of capitalism taking hold within the colonies. Virginia lawmakers wrote letters to the Oversight Authority in London explaining that they intended to pursue a divide and conquer strategy in order to prevent future rebellion. It's only after Bacon's rebellion that we see the emergence of white people as a group of humanity. It's only after Bacon's rebellion that we see the emergence of white people as a group of humanity. Let's think about this for a minute. 1681, some lawmakers invent a new label for a group of people. Imagine, if you will, just for a second, for fun here, that I'm a lawmaker, and I just pass a law claiming that 3/4 of you in this room are crunchies. Okay? So 3/4 of you are crunchies, and the other 1/4 of you are not. Who gives a damn? Who would care? Some silly lawmaker came up with a label for you. It's really unlikely that it would mean much. But let's say I follow it with this. Those who are crunchies, you can pay no more than $25 a night for that hotel. No more. Those who are crunchies are the first to come into any room at this conference and the first to leave. The first in line at the bathroom, at lunch, at any other line that forms, and the first to get to leave. And that these privileges and advantages that come by virtue of this label that I asserted upon you as a lawmaker continues when you walk out these doors. That it shapes how you are treated and what you get to do for years and years to come. Imagine you're one of the crunchies. Imagine how you might start to feel. Wow, I must be special. Imagine you're not a crunchy. Wow, what's wrong with me? This is not fair. Let's return to the divide and conquer strategy. Laborers prior and through Bacon's rebellion were united. They lived the same darn lives. They faced the same opportunities, rights, and privileges once they were freed from enslavement or free from indenture. That's about to change. A slew of laws were passed in the decades after Bacon's Rebellion and continued to get passed into the first quarter of the next century. The first slew of laws included the prohibition of free blacks from holding public office, the prohibition of blacks and native tribal members from marrying whites, the requirement that whites, upon completion of their terms of service, be paid goods including guns and gunpowder, a prohibition of free blacks possessing a weapon. We're going to come back to that. The prohibition of blacks testifying against whites. These laws began to give different meaning to these labels that prior to this moment just referenced where your nation of origin was. Not anymore. I want to return quickly to the law that prohibited free blacks from possessing a weapon. What this law did was essentially strip free black men of their ability to hold patriarchal power. Because look, under the law of coverture, here's how things worked. Men were in control, controlled women, their spouse, controlled their children, and had legal authority to do so, including severe beatings, all financial assets and land. The man had the control. But the exchange was that in exchange for that authority, he protects. That's the trade-off for patriarchal power. Stripped, made impossible by virtue of this law. And then let's look at this law that prohibited blacks from testifying against whites. We will see that throughout U.S. history. Mexicans prohibited from testifying against whites, Chinese prohibited from testifying against whites, and then it just becomes mongrels, the label, to include persons of Japanese descent and the like. So that's a law that we see throughout U.S. history. When you look at these laws, what's the message to white people? Each one of these laws has a message to this new group of people called white folks, on the one hand, and a message to those who it denies or restricts on the other. Each one of them. This package of laws, first passed after Bacon's Rebellion, did something extraordinary. Let's imagine that that light up there represents the landholding elite, the 1%. And this represents the socioeconomic ladder in the colony, okay? And so this hand over here represents this new group of laborers called white ones. And this hand over here represents laborers of African descent and members of native tribes. Before Bacon's Rebellion and through it, these laborers had the same lives, faced the same opportunities, and that changed. But when you look at these laws that passed that created this change, it divided these, created different meaning for this group versus this group, but it didn't do a whole lot to lift the economic status of white people closer to that of the white elites. Very little movement up. What it did do was it plummeted the bottom, created a new bottom to colonial society, and shoved persons of African descent and members of native tribes there. So let's look at this group of humanity called white people. We learn from this history that white people were built upon the idea that British had of themselves as white, as Christian, as freeborn, as deserving of rights and privileges from which others can be denied. To this day, white people have not been defined as a matter of law to this day. This history teaches us that white is the tool by which laborers were divided, those who shared the same living conditions, the same opportunities, now experience ourselves as more connected with Paris Hilton than with our African American neighbor, even though our economic status is far more similar to that neighbor than to the lives of the 1%. But not only did this new organization of society create a new bottom to it, it created a link that heretofore had not existed that connected this new group of laborers called white people with the elite. And what was that connection? This shared status called white, embedded with the presumption of its superiority. The other thing to note about the invention of white people and the meaning of white that this history reveals is that white constituted the center of patriarchal power. And we see that most clearly through anti-miscegenation law and specifically through its enforcement. We're going to move from the 17th century into the 18th century. The American Revolution has taken place, and the First Congress of the United States of America will meet for the first time. And when they meet, they will establish laws regarding citizenship in this new country. This is the building actually in New York where the first Congress met. Here are the men who represented the first Congress. These laws regarding citizenship include an area of law called naturalization law. Naturalization law provides the process by which one who is not born in a country can become a citizen. The first Congress of the United States determined 1790 that in order to become a naturalized citizen of this new republic called the United States of America, one had to be white. This was valid law in the United States until 1952. You had to be white to be a U.S. citizen. 1952. Now, as is often the case, laws impact those who are gendered female differently than those who are gendered male. No less true with the naturalization law. For example, white women who were citizens, if they dared to marry a man who was ineligible for citizenship via the naturalization law, in other words, he wasn't white, she loses her citizenship. These laws work to make white women most available to white men, and frankly, all women available to white men. The requirement of whiteness in naturalization law has had a significant impact on various groups of people who've come to the United States of America. In fact, the naturalization law was a significant piece of evidence used in the Plessy versus Ferguson case in 1896 to determine that U.S. citizenship status and therefore the protections of the constitutions were never intended to be applied to persons of African descent.
What?
U.S. citizenship status and therefore the protections of the constitutions were never intended to be applied to persons of African descent. Naturalization law assured that the masses of Chinese laborers and then Japanese laborers and then various other groups of laborers who came to this country would remain cheap, dependent labor. Why? Because even though they were significant in number, especially relative to their employer and landholders and railroad companies, if you're not white, you're not a U.S. citizen. If you're not a U.S. citizen, you don't vote. If you can't vote, you can't voice your political needs and desires, thereby reducing these groups of people to dependent, cheap labor. In addition, naturalization law was used to block persons of Chinese and Japanese and Filipinos, and we could go on, various groups. Not only did it result in them getting paid less for doing the same job, but all kinds of taxes got imposed upon them. So there was a foreign wage tax, various laws were passed that blocked them from being able to work in the public sector, blocked them from being able to hold a managerial position, and then of course alien land laws were passed. These were laws that made it illegal for those ineligible for naturalization, i.e. not white people, made it illegal for them to own property. And so what's the result of these laws for white people, right? Because we're real good about seeing the harm that these laws cause for certain groups. But let's get the flip side of that coin. When I make land, when I make a whole group of people ineligible to purchase land, it makes more land available and cheaper for me, for white people. When you're the lowest paid worker and prohibited from moving up as a matter of law, then those positions that get paid more, that are more desirable, are more available to white people. So we see, just from this one law, and I could spend another hour with you at least going through these combinations of law, naturalization law, anti-miscegenation law, and immigration policy, all that combined in these ways to continue to advantage, to give economic value, symbolic value to white people, to give us the unearned advantages that we continue to receive today.
The source comes from the Cherokee Nation Supreme Court records. There, in 1833, a lady named Molly Hightower claimed that a woman named Chickaw, who is the primary person mentioned in the document, that Chickaw and her sons belonged to Molly Hightower. And this claim was based on a transaction between another man named Sam Dent to Molly Hightower's father. Sam Dent had been married to a Cherokee wife sometime prior to the Revolutionary War, and he actually beat and killed his Cherokee wife. According to the Cherokee law of blood, the Deer Clan sought revenge on Sam Dent for the death of their family member, because his wife had been a Deer Clan member. And instead of subjecting himself to Deer Clan punishment, he purchased a slave named Molly, who then became Chickaw, our main character in this document, to replace his dead wife. So he gifted the Deer Clan with the slave that he had purchased as a way of meeting his obligation for killing his wife. The Deer Clan adopted the slave named Molly, gave her the name Chickaw, and as the document says, she has by herself and descendants been ever since recognized by said nation, the Cherokee Nation, or clan, the Deer Clan, as a Cherokee. That's what allowed her sons to then also be members of the Deer Clan and full-fledged members of the Cherokee Nation. So then later on in 1833, Molly Hightower comes into the picture and says that Sam Dent sold Chickaw to her father, and that she actually owns Chickaw and Chickaw's descendants, Chickaw's sons. As the document says, her father was also an Indian trader who lived many years near the descendants of Chickaw, and who never advanced or set up any claim to Chickaw and her son, Chenestity, who's also called Isaac Tucker in the document. And this document's interesting because it has a number of different names. You have English names, you have Cherokee names, you have a variety of different identities that are represented in the one document, in addition to this interesting transaction over slave property. The Deer Clan objected to Molly Hightower's claim and decided to petition the Cherokee Supreme Court to prevent the return of Chickaw and her son Chenestity to slavery. And the Deer Clan petitions them to resist this oppression and illegal wrong attempted to be practiced on our brother and sister by the Hightower, Molly Hightower, in carrying into slavery, two of whom have ever been and considered native Cherokee. So what that particular statement represents is an affirmation by the Deer Clan that Molly is their kin, that Chickaw, Molly/Chickaw, is their kin and belongs to them. It's really an affirmation of the adoption process and how seriously the Cherokees took their law of blood to bring in someone who had been an outsider to their community and adopting them, making them full-fledged family members, and not wanting them to return to the condition of slavery. Ultimately, the document indicates that the Supreme Court sided with the Deer Clan, saying that since Chickaw's adoption, she has, quote, continued in the nation and enjoyed the liberty of freedom, and that her two sons, Edward and Isaac Tucker, were born at the beloved town called Ochota on the Tennessee River. That was one of the main towns of the Cherokee Nation, what they called their beloved town, and has ever been free and resided in the nation.
Anyone who had one drop of other than white blood was listed as colored.
We couldn't claim we were Indian. It was against the law to say we were Indian. It was against the law to say we were Indian.
The Racial Integrity Act, which Plecker pushed, stood until 1967. Of all the people buried here in historic Hollywood Cemetery, including presidents, generals, and statesmen, few have had the impact of Dr. Walter Plecker. His stormy legacy continues today.
My parents always made sure that we knew the story about what Walter Plecker had done and how it had affected our people.
Plecker was a menace to Virginia Indians over many years.
Well, Dr. Plecker was convinced that there was a need to purify the white race. He thought that he was preserving the Commonwealth of Virginia, that he was maintaining the United States of America, and most importantly to him, that he was protecting the white race.
For 34 years, starting in 1912, Dr. Plecker was the director of the state's Bureau of Vital Statistics, carefully compiling birth and death records. Anyone who had one drop of other than white blood was listed as colored. They were mongrels, in his view. Plecker was relentless. With great energy, he compiled lists and wrote letters chastising whites who applied for marriage licenses with those Plecker thought were impure.
There's no question that Plecker was incredibly aggressive about using the few prerogatives the law gave him to register people. He used those prerogatives really to threaten people, to coerce them. Dr. Plecker once boasted that he had a list of people by race that rivaled that list that was kept by Hitler of the Jews.
Virginia Indians particularly felt his wrath. Quote, like rats when you're not watching, he wrote, they've been sneaking in their birth certificates through their own midwives.
You know, we couldn't claim we were Indian. It was against the law to say we were Indian. What do we claim? You know, we're not black and we're not white.
That whole idea that you are not what you believe yourself to be.
Whole groups of people who formerly were recognized among the tribes of Virginia simply disappeared from the records. They were no longer considered to be Native Americans or Indians, as they were called. Their children were not recognized as members of the tribes, and they're living with that legacy right now.
Plecker and his many supporters believed not only that races should never intermarry, they shouldn't even mingle. Strict segregation would last for generations. Blacks had to have their own schools and neighborhoods. So did Indians.
This was the schoolhouse, and for a long time, up until 1908, the church.
We blame Plecker, but he gave it to a very hungry audience. They ate it up.
Indeed, Plecker was seen as a heroic figure in an era when genetic engineering was becoming mainstream. The eugenics movement was white supremacy cloaked in science. Its supporters were many and influential, from leading academics at University of Virginia to wealthy industrialists.
We have to remember that in the 1920s, most people lived on farms. So people knew about livestock. They knew about growing corn. They knew about culling the herd and getting rid of the ones that weren't any good and keeping the ones that were the most sound. And so these ideas of animal husbandry were useful to people making biological arguments about society.
There was a lot of cross-pollination between Virginia's movement and Adolf Hitler's quest for a master race. The Richmond Times-Dispatch editorialized in 1924 that racial intermingling would ruin the white man. Quote, once a drop of inferior blood gets in his veins, he descends lower and lower in the mongrel scale. That was the year the General Assembly passed the Racial Integrity Act, narrowly defining race and making it illegal for whites to marry anyone of any other race. Plecker wrote to the governors of the rest of the states, urging them to pass similar laws to save the white race.
We have a law.
There's a sterilization law that's passed in Virginia, upheld later in the United States Supreme Court, allowing some 60,000 plus people to be sterilized in institutions, 32 states all over the country.
Well, we're trying to help them, Alice, and you too. Have your entire family sterilized.
The Racial Integrity Act, which Plecker pushed, stood until 1967, when the appropriately named Loving case about an interracial couple led to a U.S. Supreme Court reversal. But the damage to Virginia's Indian tribes continues. There are more than 560 federally recognized Indian tribes in the country, but none of Virginia's tribes, the ones that helped the settlers survive, have that crucial recognition, because Walter Plecker did everything he could to destroy evidence of their existence.
I don't know that you can ever atone for the bad things that have been done, and we are people who believe in forgiveness and humanity and brotherhood, and so let's make today a new day.
In less than a century, what Dr. Plecker feared the most has come to pass.
I'm sure that Dr. Plecker would be shocked to walk through a city like Washington, D.C., or for that matter, downtown Richmond, and see that there were people of different races walking hand in hand. It wasn't the world that he looked forward to. He really looked forward to a very different, much more restricted world.
Now, Native people, my people, were classified as mulatto. Okay. Now that was a term that not necessarily mean half white, half black, or half Indian, half white, or half Indian, half black. It was a term that the colonials created back in the early 1700s, and in reality, in many cases, it means purebred Native American. And that term mulatto, I mean, the first one was 1824, the first Racial Integrity Act, 1824, and then 1924 was the last one in Virginia that was brought about during the Plequerism. So when you're doing genealogical searches, unless you can talk to your ancestors, your parents, your grandmothers, great-grandmothers, and I tell people when I do presentations, talk to your people and ask from whence came I, so I can know how far I still have to go, okay? Because Go ahead.
Let me ask Dr. Bozier. Talk to me about the relationship then, as Indians started to assimilate into other cultures because they weren't recognized on their own. What was happening back then?
Yes, and especially when I was growing up, there was standoffish between the Indian Native American community and the African American community because of what had happened to them with past relationships, and the Plecker and Dr. Plecker's very active role in the 1920s. So there was, and of course that has always been the case in the history of any organization. The majority group tend to divide those those minorities and keep them separated.
But is the relationship any better? Has it changed?
Sure, the relationship is better. A lot of us as First Americans were amalgamated into schools for free people of color. Okay, I remember my first time going to school. I walked 2.5 miles a day round trip to a school called Diamond Grove School, founded in 1919 under the Rose Wall. Okay, it was another school that my parents and them went to out of Artistown. Then it became the Rose Wall School in 1919. It ended in 1957. Okay, so I had to walk to this school, and I walked back and forth. So there's an amalgamation not only between free people of color and Native people. There was an amalgamation also between colonials. I mean, that happened. Matter of fact, that was one of the things that William Byrd, who was involved in the dividing line between Virginia and North Carolina, and Alexander Spotswood, was trying to amalgamate Native people with other races to get rid of the Indians. Now, when you look at the Byrd papers, and you would read his diary on April the 7th, 1728, he actually visited our reservation in Jerusalem, Cortland, Virginia. And what's so interesting about that, he described how our people look. He said the young men came out and their faces were painted and they made all kinds of grotesque figures and they danced for him to the sound of a gore drum stretched tight with an animal skin. Then he said the young women came out and they were tall and shapely and dressed in their finery. Their hair was braided, and they had white and blue conch shells in their hair that hung like locks and around their neck. And then they had wrapped around their body a match coat, which was red and blue, which is a shawl, that fitted loosely about their body, that their mahogany skin shone through. Then he went. Let me get this point. He went on to say that these dark angels would make exceptional wives for the English planters, and their dark skin would bleach out in 2 generations. Unquote. That's a quote that he made.
So that was the whole goal, was to try to bleach out, as they say.
Yeah, but it kind of tells you that First Americans were a rich brown people. They were mahogany in color.